Good day.
Today is Monday, 23rd June 2025, and the last 24 hours have again been momentous after the American strikes on the nuclear facilities in Iran. We've seen the President of the United States, Donald Trump, make public comments which appear to undermine the credibility of his own officials and set him at odds with the stated policy of his own administration. We have seen the President of Russia, perhaps more pertinently, speak of unprovoked aggression carried out against Iran. He's used the term aggression for the first time, and he has talked about the steps that Russia might take to assist Iran. And lastly, we've had much commentary and discussion about the next steps that the various sides, Iran, the United States, Israel, and various third parties might take in response to this emerging and developing crisis. But before I discuss any of these things, I'm going to turn first to what is actually known about the effect of the strikes themselves, about their success or otherwise in terms of the stated intention, which is to put back Iran's nuclear enrichment program, or perhaps more accurately, to put back whatever program Iran might have had, actual or conceptual, to move forward towards acquiring a nuclear weapon. Now, we've had 3 strikes against 3 facilities. The biggest by far in terms of the weight of ordnance was the one on the facility in Fordow, but we've also had strikes on the facilities at Natanz and Esfahan. And if you go across the media, if you look at what the Iranians themselves have said, if you look at what the Russians are saying, importantly, if you look at what the Americans are also saying. And lastly, if you look at what the IAEA are saying, the International Atomic Energy Agency are saying, no one can say with any confidence what the extent of the damage to any of these 3 locations is. But I think that there is an emerging view which is not yet a consensus. It falls well short of a consensus, that the attack on Fordow was far from conclusive, that some damage was indeed done to the facility, but that it's likely that the facility in its totality has withstood the attack, that the some of the centrifuges at least are still capable of being operated. Some of the cascades and other technology deep down in the tunnels has survived intact, though the Iranians themselves accept that they would have to enter the facility, go deep inside the caverns, clear the exit and entry points which have received the most damage, to find out what actual damage to the facility has been done. So all of this is very qualified at the moment, but reading American reports, even those put out officially by officials of the US government, it's clear that they are far from sure that Fordow in particular has been damaged either beyond repair or even beyond the point where repair would be needed over multiple months. Even American officials seem to accept that it's likely that the facility in Fordow has survived to a greater or lesser degree, whilst other reports, other assessments go further than this and believe that the facility overall may be not just retrievable, but even mostly intact. Now, all of this, as I said, is still very qualified. The satellite pictures that have appeared and remember what I say about my inability to make much sense of satellite pictures. It's inconclusive. They're inconclusive. They don't tell us very much. To the extent that they appear to say anything, it leans again towards the proposition, the view that the Fordow facility, at least, has mostly survived. Well, if so, that would be very bad in itself. The United States has conducted a massive bomb attack on Fordow using a large proportion of its very limited stockpile of these massive bunker busting bombs. If they failed to destroy or obliterate Fordow, as the President of the United States optimistically claimed, then that would be a blow in itself. But unfortunately, putting all that aside, at least unfortunately from the Americans, perhaps unfortunately altogether, the news is much worse, because the Iranians, before the attack on these three locations, claim, the Iranians say, that they had already evacuated their 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium from these locations. There's some reports that they actually removed the entire stockpile of uranium that they had, not just the highly enriched uranium, but the enriched uranium to lower levels. That would in total weigh around 8 tons, that they'd already been removed from the various sites, particularly the one in Esfahan, where it seems this uranium was being stored, and that the uranium is now in a location which is unknown to the United States and to Israel. They have no idea where this uranium is. And there are reports also coming from Iran, but also supported by the International Atomic Energy Agency and by US officials, that it was not just the uranium itself, the uranium stockpile, which has disappeared, but that the Iranians, in the days before the attack on these three facilities, also relocated some of the necessary equipment, and that there might indeed even be somewhere in Iran, in some unknown location, and bear in mind, we're talking about an enormous country, heavily mountainous, in many places heavily forested. There may be one or more facilities where this uranium, which has been relocated from these sites, where it could be enriched up to the necessary level to create nuclear weapons. And on this topic, I've had a rather disturbing email from an acquaintance of mine, more than an acquaintance, somebody I've come to consider a friend, incidentally, somebody who is much more knowledgeable about these sort of things than I am. And this person has actually made a point which I was not aware of, and freely admit I was not aware of. He's pointed out that it is a misconception that uranium needs to be enriched up to 90% levels in order to be effective, in order to be convertible into nuclear weapons use. Early first generation nuclear weapons of the early 1950s utilized uranium enriched to significantly lower levels, well within the range that Iran has already achieved. The problem with nuclear weapons of that kind is that they would be large and bulky, and Iran probably doesn't have the means, therefore, to deploy them. But anyway, it would be possible, at least in theory, for Iran to develop nuclear weapons, a nuclear weapon, or at least a nuclear device, with the uranium it already has. Now, as I said, I wasn't aware of any of this. It's absolute news to me. I'm surprised I'm not seeing it reported in other places. If anybody wants to push back on that, then they're free to do so. But the point is that even if that is not the Iranian plan, even if they want to deploy and develop warheads using their existing enriched uranium by enriching it to higher levels, then it seems that they have the uranium still with which to do that. They've retained their stockpile, and they may have other sites with centrifuges unknown to the IAEA where further enrichment could be undertaken in order to bring their uranium up to that sort of level. It would not astonish me. I don't know that that is true, but to repeat again, the uranium stockpile, the enriched uranium stockpile, has disappeared and no one knows where it is. So let's take a step back and think through the implications of that. 2 weeks ago, we knew exactly where the Iranian uranium stockpile was located. I say that because Iran had admitted IAEA inspectors to its known nuclear sites. Those inspectors were examining those sites. They examined the site in Fordow, Natanz, Esfahan. They were able to keep track of the uranium stockpile. I understand that no nation in the world had as many inspections carried out on its nuclear facilities as Iran has done. So everything about the stockpile itself and about the larger nuclear program was known and was being monitored and was being reported about by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And incidentally and importantly, the International Atomic Energy Agency had overall regulation of all of the sites, Natanz, Esfahan, and Fordow, which has now been attacked. What we now have is a situation where Iran is in possession of a stockpile of highly enriched uranium up to a 60% level, and nobody knows where it is, where the IAEA doesn't know where it is, whereas US officials have admitted the United States doesn't know where it is, where Israel too apparently doesn't appear to know where it is, where no one, apart from a small number of Iranian officials and scientists and other personnel, know where it is. In other words, we have gone from a situation 2 weeks ago where the Iranian nuclear enrichment program was in the light to a situation today where it is completely in the dark. To get a sense of how extraordinary that is, let's go back to the hapless, in my opinion, profoundly incompetent director of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, who has absolutely no idea, it seems to me, of what his responsibilities and those of his agency are under the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and who has gone bent over backwards repeatedly to accommodate the United States and the other Western powers, neglecting the overall responsibilities of his agency. Anyway, he is now complaining that Iran removing its uranium enrichment facilities to some other location violates its Iran's responsibilities to keep the IAEA informed as to what it is doing. It seems to me surreal, after all that has happened, that the director of the IAEA ought to be is speaking in this way, instead of recognizing the catastrophic failure of himself and of his own agency in protecting the facilities that his agency was responsible for inspecting and regulating. As his predecessor, Mohammed el-Baradei, has pointed out, the attacks on the nuclear enrichment facilities carried out by the United States violate protocols that date from the 1950s. They are contrary to international law. But Rafael Grossi has said nothing about this. Instead, absurdly, after an attack of this kind, he demands that Iran disclose the secret location of its enriched uranium, thereby confirming that he and his agency have completely lost control of the stockpile and have failed in their mission in Iran, which they were charged with executing. It seems to me that Grossi absolutely should resign. His incompetence has played a huge role in bringing about this crisis. Not that I expect that he will pay any attention to me. Anyway, there we go. So we have completely lost track of what Iran might from this point on be doing with its enriched uranium. It might be further enriching it. It might be preparing to use it for some other purpose. It might play games with it, telling us that it might be considering doing something with it or might not be doing something with it. From this point on, we simply don't know. Now, if you think this is just me saying all of this, let's go to the Financial Times today, which published a big article, Where is Iran's Uranium? And it contains comments like this: as the Trump administration conducts its damage assessment, the critical question will be whether Iran's program has been destroyed and what its enrichment potential is. It comes down to the material and where it is, said Richard Nephew, a former senior US official who worked on Iran in the Obama and Biden administrations. On the basis of what we've seen at this point, we don't know where the material is. We don't have any real confidence that we've got the ability to get it anytime soon. I think you would be foolish if you said that the program was delayed by anything more than a few months. And we've had other statements from other people commenting, experts commenting in this same article. We've had comments from Iranian officials that enriched materials, indigenous knowledge, political will remain. This is from Ali Shamkhani, the senior advisor to the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, about the enrichment program. Even if nuclear sites are destroyed, the game isn't over, he wrote on X. And we then go on to read in the same article that the risk was always that after Israel launched its bombing campaign on the pretext of destroying Tehran's nuclear program, Iran would secretly take the stockpile to hidden locations where advanced centrifuges had been covertly set up. And it's conceded that this could be the case if they've got a uranium conversion line set up and if they were able to enrich up to 90% of Fordow before it was attacked, and they had 8 or 9 days, that's potentially enough for 2 bombs worth of 90%. And we're reminded that Iran, Pakistan, and North Korea managed to do the same thing. And we have others like Sima Shine, a former Iran specialist at Mossad, saying that she was convinced that Iran had moved the enriched material. They have enough enriched uranium somewhere, and they took some advanced centrifuges somewhere in order to enable them to someday go to a nuclear device. The program is not destroyed completely, no matter what the Americans say. And we've had another Israeli official, acknowledging that Iran could have spirited away at least some of its highly enriched stockpile. It seems it's enriched, it's hidden away all of it. Anyway, the article continues along these lines, and we're told again that it's certainly not the end of its program. They'll be able to continue it in some form or other if that is their choice. So, as I said, we have replaced, or so it seems to me, a enrichment program which was out there in the open with an enrichment or potential enrichment and conceivably nuclear weapons program that we now know nothing about. Now, to add to all of this, friends of Iran are now approaching Iran with proposals, very alarming and concerning proposals, according to the Russians. Now, I'm hearing these reports from various sources. One of them, of course, is an open source, and that is the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev. He's done a long message on his Telegram channel in which he says that Iran has now been contacted by several countries that are actually offering to provide Iran with nuclear warheads. He speaks about several countries. I don't know which countries he's referring to, but logical inference would suggest that one of them is North Korea, which of course has its own nuclear arsenal, which it developed itself and which it developed covertly, and which has a long-standing and very friendly relationship with Iran going back to the 1980s, and which is known to have cooperated with Iran on many types of military sectors and military technologies and that kind of thing. Now, supplementing what Medvedev has said, I have obtained reports from two completely different sources, both of which are saying the same thing, that the Russians have been informed by North Korea that they do want to supply, or that they are prepared to supply, nuclear weapons to Iran, that the North Koreans, for the moment, are asking China and Russia to green light this transfer of nuclear weapons to Iran. And in the case of one source, which I believe completely, by the way, I'm told that the Russians and the Chinese, for the moment, are saying a categorical no. But apparently that proposal has been made. It has been communicated to the North Koreans, but by the North Koreans to the Iranians. There's no word what the Iranian response has been, but the Russians remain strongly opposed. They continue to be profoundly and strongly opposed to nuclear proliferation. They are alarmed by what they see as the collapse of the whole process of limiting nuclear proliferation. They are worried about the collapse of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and of all of the safeguards that were first proposed by the United States in the 1960s and which the Russians supported at that time. Russia, incidentally, has been always one of the most stalwart supporters of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. A historical detail unknown to many people or forgotten by many people is that way back in the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union actually publicly declared that it had agreed to share nuclear weapons technology with China and would help China, with which the Soviet Union was at that time in alliance, to develop nuclear weapons. There was a public announcement to that effect by the Soviet Union in the mid-1950s. And then just a few weeks later, the Soviets completely reversed course. They suddenly announced that they thought about it again and they had decided that they would not provide nuclear weapons or nuclear technology to China after all. The Chinese were absolutely furious, as one can imagine, and it played a significant role. This event played a significant role subsequently in precipitating the Sino-Soviet split. It was one of the actions that the Soviet Union took which caused the Chinese to reassess their alliance with the Soviet Union. The Russians have always been staunch supporters of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This incident with China took place in the 1950s, a decade before the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed. There has been never any suggestion since the signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that the Russians have ever violated it. So the Russians do not want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. They made that very clear many times. I've already discussed in previous programs why they would be horrified were that to happen. They would see Iran acquiring nuclear weapons as a further step in the collapse of the whole nuclear non-proliferation regime. They understand that Saudi Arabia and Turkey and possibly Egypt would quickly follow suit and acquire nuclear weapons themselves. They also obviously worry that other countries hostile to Russia, Ukraine, for example, might be emboldened to acquire nuclear weapons as well. After all, it's not as if Zelensky doesn't talk about this often. So the Russians remain strong opponents of the spread of nuclear weapons, and there is no doubt at all in my mind that they would come down strongly against any attempt by North Korea to send nuclear weapons to Iran. The Chinese, I have no doubt, take exactly the same view. And here it's perhaps worth saying something about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because there is a key trade-off embodied in the treaty that I don't think is widely understood by many of the people who comment about it. When the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was agreed in the 1960s, it was widely assumed that nuclear technology would be the way forward and that it would be the most important of all technologies and the one that would reshape the global energy system. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty therefore essentially incorporated a trade-off. Countries like Iran, which signed up to it, would agree under no circumstances to seek to acquire nuclear weapons, but in return would be given freedom, complete freedom, to develop peaceful uses of nuclear energy, to develop their nuclear industry to the highest and most advanced possible level that was within their resources. That was the trade-off. No nuclear weapons, but in return, you can have full access to civilian, peaceful uses of nuclear technology and nuclear energy. What has happened over the last few days is that first Israel and then the United States has attacked nuclear facilities in Iran, which Iran was operating within its rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and which were inspected and therefore regulated and to some extent protected by the agency that was created to basically enforce the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency. The attack on the facilities is not just a violation of international law. It breaches in the most fundamental way the contract that exists at the heart of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It attacks peaceful sites in a way that could potentially incentivize Iran to move forward to developing nuclear weapons, because it can say that the part of the treaty which provided benefits to Iran has now been breached. One government which has been making this point, and has been making a point clearly, is the Chinese government. There has been a long editorial about this in Global Times, and this is what it says. What the US bombs have impacted is the foundation of the international security order. By attacking nuclear facilities under the safeguards of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Washington has set a dangerous precedent. This action bypasses both the UN Security Council and the IAEA framework, attempting to resolve unilaterally the Iranian nuclear issue through force. This is a serious violation of the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and international law, as well as a rejection of the principled position of the international community, including China and the European Union, which has dealt with the Iranian nuclear issue through multilateral negotiations for many years. Washington's boast of close cooperation with Israel as a team confirms its nature of dragging its ally against international morality and multilateralism. Anyway, there we are. So this is the situation that we now face today. Iran now has a nuclear stockpile which is not being inspected. It is not being regulated. Nobody knows where it is. It's getting offers of assistance from countries apparently like North Korea, which ought to be extremely alarming. It might have centrifuges hidden away which it can use to enrich its stockpile. Or perhaps it could rebuild its centrifuges. It has that technology. And arguably, it has been incentivized. In fact, not arguably, it has been incentivized to go down the path towards nuclear weapons development because it has been attacked, and also because the regime of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and of the IAEA, which Iran was observing and which supposedly provided it with safeguards, has now been flagrantly breached. I have to say, to me, this looks like a complete debacle. Again, I don't know what advice the President of the United States and his officials have been getting, but every step that has been taken has led us to this point, and it seems that obvious steps that the Iranians might take, like removing and hiding their enriched uranium, that those steps had not been foreseen and thought through. Anyway, that now brings me to the President of the United States, because he has, on top of everything else, now begun what, as far as I can see, is a disastrous process of undermining his own administration and his own officials. So, a couple of days ago, on the Duran, Professor Mearsheimer and Glenn Deason and myself did a program in which Professor Mearsheimer floated the possibility that Donald Trump might try to get out of the situation in which Israel and the United States and he himself had found himself in by conducting a strike against the Iranian facilities, nuclear facilities, and then calling it a day, saying that was the end. He'd done all that he needed to do. He had achieved the win, and from that moment on, he could move on. Well, that seemed to be the policy for the first few hours after the United States conducted the attack. So Donald Trump made comments and published posts talking about how after the attack on the Iranian facilities, the right thing for Iran to do now was to begin negotiations, to resume negotiations, that the attack had been a huge success, that Iran's program had been set back, that the sites themselves had been obliterated. And he seemed to be giving the impression that the attack itself was as far as the United States intended to go. And then, over the course of yesterday, a whole succession of US officials started to say the same thing. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said that there was no plan by the United States to enlarge the war, that the United States had no interest in a prolonged war in Iran, that the United States was not seeking regime change in Iran. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, said all of these same things in much greater detail over the course of long interviews that he gave on US television. The US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, said essentially the same things. 4 times over the course of a Pentagon briefing, he insisted that the United States was not seeking regime change in Iran. And then, even as the President of the United States, all of these officials were saying all of these things, the President of the United States publishes this extraordinary comment. It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? Question mark. MIGA, make Iran great again. Exclamation mark. In other words, the President of the United States is now giving every appearance of endorsing the project of achieving regime change in Iran. And in doing so, he has pulled the rug beneath all of his officials. J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, they may all be saying that the United States' objective is not regime change in Iran, but here we have the President of the United States basically telling us what a wonderful thing regime change in Iran would be. Even some of Donald Trump's most loyal supporters on the MAGA side of the Republican Party are now in dismay. This is a comment that has appeared on the Federalist this morning. On Sunday, Trump posted a disturbing comment about how it's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be regime change? MIGA. This is precisely the wrong view to take on Iran. The American interest in Iran is straightforward and strictly limited, that it should not be hostile to the United States. It can remain a repressive autocracy ruled by Islamic radicals so long as they represent no threat to America. Whether the current Iranian regime is able to make Iran great again, whatever that means, is of no consequence to Americans. We don't care whether Iran is great, middling, or riven by internal strife. All that matters for us is that Iran is not a threat to us. Well, there we go. And of course, it gets worse because Donald Trump is now turning publicly against some of the key figures within the MAGA base who are within the House of Representatives. He's starting to say incredibly rude things about Representative Tom Massey, who is very popular in his state and amongst the MAGA movement in general, and certainly amongst the more libertarian members of the MAGA base. And there's even talk that he's now going to campaign to prevent Tom Massey being re-elected to Congress in the midterms, in the 2028 midterms, and that a super PAC is being created with Donald Trump's blessing to prevent Tom Massey's re-election. All of this is astonishing, but let's put aside the damage that Donald Trump is doing to his own administration, and his own political future, which at this point, frankly, is almost an irrelevance. The fact that the President of the United States is talking in this way can only mean that he is going against what his senior officials, Rubio, Hegseth, and Vance, are all saying, that he is indeed supporting Prime Minister Netanyahu's drive to achieve regime change in Iran. And that, of course, brings us to what may come next, because Iran continues to launch missiles at Israel. Israel continues to conduct airstrikes and missile strikes against Iran. There continue to be reports that Israel is running out of air defense missiles. Sooner or later, if this continues, the Israelis inevitably are going to come back and are going to ask Donald Trump to come to their rescue again and to launch more strikes against Iran. And given that the President, Donald Trump, is now endorsing regime change against Iran, who any longer can seriously believe that he will not provide that support? Of course he will. And sooner or later, he's going to be drawn into another operation, a long-term war by the United States to achieve regime change against Iran. And of course, he's going to do that against the wishes of his electoral base, against the majority view of most Americans in the United States. And he's also inevitably going to find, or so it seems to me, that this project to achieve regime change in Iran, which, to say it simply, for the moment, doesn't seem to be succeeding in Iran itself. All the indications are that the attacks on Iran are consolidating Iranian society rather than dividing it. Anyway, all of these steps are inevitably going to provoke a very strong international reaction. And now that brings me to perhaps the other big news of the day, which is the meeting in Moscow of the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi with the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Now, as I anticipated, the Russians have not provided us with a readout of this meeting. And that in itself is interesting and important, but they have provided us with a transcript of Putin's introductory words. And US officials, in my opinion, should take these very seriously. So we have pictures of Putin meeting with Araghchi. They're meeting clearly in the Kremlin. And these were Putin's words to Araghchi, the ones that have been broadcast on Russian television, and of which the Kremlin has provided us with a translation and a translation. And these are what he said. I'm happy to see you. Good afternoon and welcome. You are visiting Russia during a challenging period marked by a significant escalation of tensions, both in the region and surrounding your country. Russia's position on the current developments is well known. It has been clearly expressed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is reflected in the stance we've taken at the United Nations Security Council, with which you are already familiar. The completely unprovoked act of aggression against Iran is without foundation or justification. Now, these are extremely important words. First of all, Putin is now using aggression. He's now using the word aggression. He's doing that for the first time. I have said in previous programs that the readouts the Kremlin has provided of Putin's conversations with various world leaders, in which he has spoken about how first the Israeli attack and then the American attack violated the UN Charter and were contrary to international law, essentially amounted to a statement that the Israeli and American attacks amounted to aggression. But now Putin has gone an important step further. He has explicitly said that. He has expressly used those words. The completely unprovoked act of aggression against Iran is without foundation or justification. But then he has more to say. Russia has long-standing, strong and trustworthy relations with Iran, and we are committed to supporting the Iranian people through our continued efforts. We are committed to supporting the Iranian people. As you know, I have recently held telephone conversations with President of the United States, Donald Trump, Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, President of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed al-Nahyan, and President of your country, Masoud Pezeshkian. I'm also aware that you've just had meetings with foreign ministers in Europe. I am very pleased to welcome you to Moscow today. Your visit provides us with an important opportunity to discuss these sensitive issues in depth and to explore ways we might work together to navigate the current situation. So he's offering support. We are committed to supporting the Iranian people, and he says that your visit provides us with an opportunity to discuss these sensitive issues in depth and explore ways we might work together. And Peskov, his spokesman, has now had further things to say about this. The Russian media asked Peskov what exactly these offers of assistance to Iran might amount to. And the Russian news agency TASS reports Peskov's words as follows. It all depends on what Iran needs. We have offered our mediation efforts. This is concrete. We have stated our position, which is also a very important form of support for the Iranian side. Going forward, everything will depend on what Iran needs at this moment. When asked what obligations Moscow is ready to take on as an international mediator and whether it is ready to supply Iran with weapons, including S-300 and S-400 air defense systems, Peskov reiterated, everything depends on what the Iranian side, what our Iranian friends say. Just today, the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi will meet with Russian President Putin, where they will be able to exchange views in wake of this traumatic escalation. And in fact, the Iranian side will be able to inform us about its proposals and its vision of the current situation. So Peskov is saying that yes, Russia will provide diplomatic support. Yes, Russia will provide, no doubt, other types of support, mediation services, economic support, no doubt. But when asked specifically whether Russia might be willing to provide air defense systems, advanced air defense systems, S-300s and S-400s, Peskov said that it all depends on the Iranians. The Iranian side will be able to inform us about its proposals and its vision of the current situation. Everything depends on what the Iranian side, what our Iranian friends say. So there it is. I have to say this. I think that though the Russians are absolutely not going to assist Iran to develop nuclear weapons, I think, as I said, that prospect horrifies them. And they're certainly not going to facilitate the transfer of nuclear weapons from North Korea to Iran. That doesn't mean that North Korean nuclear weapons might not arrive in Iran, though it's difficult to see how, actually. But anyway, nonetheless, short of that, short of assisting Iran to go nuclear, the Russians have now publicly confirmed that as far as they are concerned, Iran is the victim of unprovoked, unjustified, illegal aggression, and they appear to be saying that they're prepared to do whatever Iran considers necessary in order to help Iran repel that aggression. And the article in Global Times strongly suggests to me that the Chinese support the Russians in that position. So, a lot depends now on what the United States does, and indeed on what Iran does. We don't know what proposals, if any, Arakshi has come to Moscow with, whether the Iranians have come with a shopping list of weapons and proposals. As Brian Baletic has pointed out in many programs, simply supplying Iran with an advanced air defense system isn't going to help Iran if they don't know how to use it, and if there isn't a proper air defense system in being to enable Iran to operate this air defense system effectively. But several programs ago, I discussed Operation Kafkas, the operation that the Russians, the Soviet Union, carried out in 1969 and 1970 to help Egypt end Israeli airstrikes on Cairo and on other Egyptian centres and population centres and facilities west of the Suez Canal, how the Soviets sent 20,000 military personnel together with air defense missiles and MiG-21 fighter jets, and how gradually, incrementally, the Russians pushed the Israelis, in that case, back to the canal and ended the Israeli airstrikes on Egypt, on the Egyptian heartlands. I'm not saying that that's what the Russians are going to do this time, but they do have the means to do it. They might have the support from the Chinese. They can start establishing safe corridors. They could start building up air defense systems, maybe in Central Asia. China and Russia have strong ties now with all of the Central Asian states. They can start doing all of that. They can start moving an air defense curtain or wall south, further south into Iran, until it eventually covers Tehran and other locations in Iran. Or maybe they will do a lot of other different things, which I'm not going to speculate about because I don't know. I don't know the details of the discussions in Moscow. But the fact is that the Russians, it looks as if, are going to be taking these steps. Everything about Putin's comments and the atmosphere of the meeting in Moscow and the statements coming out of Moscow and Beijing point clearly in that direction. If this conflict continues between Israel and Iran, if the United States continues to be as deeply involved in the conflict as the United States, or at least as its president, appears to want it to be, if the United States does indeed aim to achieve some kind of regime change in Iran, then we are at high risk of a superpower confrontation of the like we have not seen since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. At that point, the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, came into direct confrontation with each other. Urgent negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union at that time, between Kissinger and Gromyko, managed to bring the situation under control. The Soviets and the Americans agreed between them to certain ceasefire proposals, which stabilized the situation in that conflict. I'm not saying, by the way, that is the entire story of that conflict. which is a complicated one, and which, just to say quickly, the Israelis did achieve a significant military victory. But as I said, there were these superpower contacts behind the scenes, which did come after both the Soviets and the Americans intervened on the side of their respective allies, Egypt and Israel. We cannot be sure that this time, in the very complex and fraught international situation that we are looking at today, that negotiations of the kind that took place successfully in 1973 would repeat themselves successfully today. And the risk of a superpower clash has become very real, more real, in my opinion, than it has been at any time over the course of the Ukraine conflict. Anyway, there it is. I again repeat, I don't think this has been thought through. I get the sense that the president, Donald Trump, has been acting increasingly impulsively. He seems to be getting increasingly angry with members of his base. Perhaps he's received reports that the attack on the nuclear facilities was not as successful or as effective as he supposed. Maybe his last comment, this disastrous comment that he made, endorsing the regime change, was because he's suddenly realized that Iran has indeed managed to relocate its uranium enrichment, its enriched uranium, to some secret location. And he has suddenly understood, or it has been pointed out to him, that his attacks on the facilities have caused more problems, far more serious problems than they have solved. But what is urgently needed now is for the United States to start backing off, to start doing the things that Vance, Rubio, and Hegseth appear to be trying to do, to try to bring the situation under control. And that means not only getting the president himself to stop pushing things in this inflammatory way, which is, as I say, only destabilizing his own domestic political situation and undermining the authority of his own officials, but which is dragging the United States into another crisis in the Middle East, which has the makings not just of a forever war, but potentially of a superpower confrontation involving the Eurasian states, China, and especially Russia. Anyway, we shall see what happens. This is a dynamic, very dangerous situation. So far, the Iranians have not acted on their threats to close the Straits of Hormuz, which I discussed yesterday. The Iranian parliament has apparently unanimously voted in support of that, but the final decision has not yet been made. There's been no word of attacks by the Iranians on American bases. Again, I strongly suspect the Russians are advising the Iranians against taking any of these extreme steps. But they are giving Iran promises of assistance. They would not be doing that unless they had backing from China. When Xi Jinping and Putin spoke with each other a few days ago, they agreed that they would remain in close contact and that their respective officials and agencies would be in constant contact and coordinating with each other. It's likely that Turkey is also backing some of these moves. As I said, this has every potential to spiral into a superpower confrontation. And in the interests of everybody, that ought to be avoided. A huge amount of damage to the nuclear non-proliferation regime has been done. The credibility of the IAEA lies in tatters. it's debatable whether the shattered pieces of the nuclear non-proliferation regime can be put together again. But at least let's try and get through this crisis that we're facing now and see what comes. Well, all of this, even as that other war, the war in Ukraine, continues. And I'm not going to again devote a huge amount of time to discussing that war today. Reports over the last 24 hours speak of further Russian advances. I said in my program yesterday that it is now largely conceded by all parties, or all the various observers, the bloggers, the Telegram channels, the informed observers, the analysts, that a significant Ukrainian force is essentially trapped south of Konstantinovka, south of the reservoir, which lies to the south of Konstantinovka. It looks like an emerging military disaster is now rapidly evolving for the Ukrainians there. I have been reading that not only have the Russians actually captured the village of Koptyevo, north of Pokrovsk, but there is a long article in Radovka which speaks about the battle for Pokrovsk itself now being in effect underway, and it's increasingly looking as if Ukraine is in no real position to conduct a successful war conventionally for very much longer. The Ukrainian army is too depleted. It's short of men, machines, drones, shells, infantry fighting vehicles, tanks. The F-16s, as many predicted, have proved a failure. And over the last couple of hours, there's been reports of another massive Russian combined drone and missile attack on Kiev. The Ukrainians again claim that they've shot down practically everything that the Russians launched at Kiev. I don't think anybody any longer takes any of those claims seriously. The pictures and film of the explosions across Kiev tell their own story. And for the record, it looks as if there is barely any air defense over Kiev at all, operating at all at the present time. But of course, all of this now takes second place to the growing crisis in Ukraine. Zelensky has been meeting with Budanov, his military intelligence chief. He's looking for more asymmetric ways to conduct attacks against Russia. I doubt that those will achieve very much, to be honest. My own view, and I've expressed this in several places now, is that Zelensky's primary purpose at the moment is to retain control of Ukraine, to cling on to Ukraine right up until the final moment of collapse. Probably his plan thereafter is to escape with his officials to the west, to establish a government in exile somewhere in Europe, and to try to keep the conflict in some form going, both in Ukraine itself and in Russia, using the various asymmetrical methods as it's been described that he's discussing with people like Budanov. That's my own view of what Zelensky's actual plan is at the moment. I don't think that Zelensky is ever going to make peace. I think the Russians have come to understand that. But in the meantime, as I said, for the first time since it began in February 2022, the battles in Ukraine, the special military operation, look almost like a sideshow compared to the momentous events that are unfolding between Israel and Iran, and between the United States and Iran in the Middle East. I do hope people in the United States, important people in the United States, understand how dangerous the situation is now becoming. To repeat again, the United States has lost track of Iran's nuclear program. It no longer knows where the enriched uranium is or what Iran might be doing with it. It could be also that the facilities in Fordow are damaged but not destroyed. That seems to be the emerging consensus. And we now have reports of North Korea offering help to Iran. And based on what we're learning about the meeting between Arakci and Putin in Moscow, it looks like a superpower confrontation, such as we have not seen since the 1970s, may be coming as well. Well, there it is. On these rather disturbing thoughts, I end my program today. Obviously, this is a dynamic situation. We will see what happens over the next couple of days. But let me remind you again in the meantime that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.